That evening, dusk had already begun to settle when Min stopped his motorbike at the dirt road leading into a small forest on the edge of a remote village. The villagers called the place the house at the end of the forest. The house had been abandoned for more than 30 years, its walls covered with thick vines and green moss. As nightfall approached, no one dared to walk along that road. The elders often told stories that, on rainy nights, a faint yellow light could still be seen glowing behind the windows. Even though the house had been without electricity for decades, Min, however, had always been fascinated by the unknown, so he simply smiled at the local legends. Carrying a flashlight, a video camera, and a small backpack, he slowly made his way into the forest. The deeper he went, the colder the air became. The constant chorus of insects suddenly fell silent, leaving only the dry crackling of fallen leaves beneath his feet. When the abandoned house finally emerged through the thin veil of mist, Min instinctively stopped in his tracks. Part of the tiled roof had collapsed, and the rotten wooden door hung crookedly from its rusted hinges. Yet one thing immediately caught his attention. The yard in front of the house was noticeably cleaner than the surrounding area, as if someone had swept it only moments before. Min gently pushed the front door open. A long, creaking groan echoed through the empty house. Inside, everything was covered in dust, yet the furniture remained exactly where it had been left. An old wooden table, a wall clock frozen at precisely 11:47, several faded family photographs, and a rocking chair that swayed gently back and forth despite the complete absence of wind. Min reassured himself that the movement was probably caused by a draft coming through the collapsed roof. He switched on his camera and began filming, calmly introducing the eerie surroundings as he walked. As the camera slowly panned across an old mirror hanging on the wall, he caught something unexpected on the screen. Reflected behind him stood a woman dressed in a long white dress. Min spun around instantly. There was no one there. His heart pounded in his chest. He looked back at the camera screen, but the mysterious figure had vanished without a trace, as though she had never been there at all. Min continued up to the second floor. The staircase groaned and cracked beneath his feet, as though it could collapse at any moment. At the end of the dark hallway stood four closed doors. The last one was slightly ajar. From inside came the faint sound of a lullaby, so soft it was almost impossible to hear, as if someone were gently singing a child to sleep. Holding his breath, Min slowly approached. The moment his hand touched the door, the singing stopped abruptly. He pushed the door open. The room was completely empty. The only thing inside was an old wooden cradle, covered in a thick layer of dust. Yet, the cradle was gently rocking back and forth on its own. Min aimed his flashlight at the floor and noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. Tiny footprints were pressed into the thick dust, leading away from the cradle toward the window. Then they simply disappeared. At that exact moment, the camera in Min's hand suddenly began playing back the footage it had just recorded. On the screen, he saw himself standing alone in the middle of the room, but directly behind him stood a little girl, no more than 8 years old. Her long black hair covered half of her face, and she held an old, worn-out doll tightly in her arms. The terrifying part was that, in reality, the room was still completely empty. Min slowly lifted his eyes from the camera screen. A tiny voice whispered right beside his ear, "Mister, can you see me?" He whirled around. No one was there. Then, at the far end of the hallway, a door that had been firmly shut only moments before began to creak open on its own, revealing a warm golden light spilling from within. As if someone were still living inside the abandoned house, gathering every ounce of courage, Min walked toward the room glowing with warm light. Unlike the rest of the house, it showed no signs of decay. A dining table had been carefully set with 4 bowls and pairs of chopsticks. A teapot still released thin wisps of steam, and a grandfather clock ticked steadily, as though it had never stopped. Hanging on the wall was an old family portrait. Min froze. The man in the photograph had a face identical to his own. Before he could make sense of what he was seeing, the light suddenly went out. The entire house was swallowed by darkness. Then came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing from every room, drawing closer and closer. Without thinking, Min bolted down the stairs, threw open the front door, and sprinted into the forest. When he finally turned around for one last look, the house was exactly as it had been when he first arrived: dark, abandoned, and crumbling. Only one thing had changed. In a single second-floor window stood the silhouette of a little girl. She smiled at him silently before slowly pulling the old curtain shut. The next morning, Min reviewed all of the footage he had recorded. There was no trace of the mysterious woman. No little girl. No glowing room. Nothing unusual at all. Except for one barely audible sentence at the very end of the recording. "Thank you for coming to visit us." Min never told anyone about what had happened that night. He convinced himself that it had all been nothing more than exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But after returning home, something strange began to happen every night at exactly 11:47 p.m. His camera would switch itself on. The screen displayed only a single image, the second-floor hallway of the abandoned house. At first, the hallway was completely empty. A few nights later, a lone wooden chair appeared at the far end of the corridor. Several days after that, an old, weathered doll was sitting on the chair. The most terrifying part was what happened next. Each time the footage played by itself, the doll appeared just a little closer to the camera than before, as though it were slowly, patiently making its way toward whoever was watching. 1 week later, Min decided to return to the house, determined to uncover the truth. This time, he brought along his best friend, Hung. Unlike Min, Hung didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural stories. He dismissed them as nothing more than myths and overactive imaginations. The two of them came prepared, carrying a drone, high-powered flashlights, and a pair of walkie-talkies. As they stepped into the front yard, they both noticed something unusual. Fresh footprints were clearly visible in the soft earth, but there was something deeply unsettling about them. Every set of footprints led toward the house. Not a single one led back out. Hung laughed it off, saying they probably belonged to other curious explorers who had visited before them. Min forced a nod, but deep inside, an uneasy feeling began to grow. As they stepped inside, everything looked exactly as Min remembered. Everything except the wall clock. Its hands were moving again. The steady tick, tick, tick echoed through the silent house, each second sounding louder than the last. Hung reached up to take the clock down. The instant his fingers touched it, the hour hand began spinning backward at an impossible speed. The entire house trembled. It felt as though a powerful gust of wind had surged straight through the walls. With a deafening slam, the front door behind them swung shut on its own. Their flashlights flickered once, then died completely. Only the faint glow from the camera, still recording, pierced the darkness. In the dim, flickering light, the voice of a little child drifted down from the second floor. "More people have come to visit." A chorus of soft giggles followed, echoing from every direction, sometimes close enough to make their skin crawl, sometimes so distant they could barely hear them. Hung struggled to keep his composure, but the color had completely drained from his face. The two of them raced upstairs. When they reached the hallway, they froze. All four doors stood wide open. Inside each room, a single candle flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. But that wasn't what terrified Min the most. Every room contained an old portrait hanging on the wall. As Min looked more closely, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The portraits were of people who had mysteriously disappeared in the forest over the years. Just as they were about to leave, Hung suddenly stopped in his tracks in front of the last portrait at the end of the hallway. There were the new faces in the picture. One was Min, the other was Hung. Beneath the aged, yellowed frame, an old inscription was carved into the wood: "The next visitors." The two friends stared at each other in stunned silence. Neither of them could find the words to speak. Then, from somewhere behind them, came the slow creak of a wooden door closing. The hallway was swallowed by darkness. And from just behind their backs, a faint whisper drifted through the silence. This time, "Don't leave so soon." Min grabbed Hung by the arm, and the two of them sprinted toward the staircase. But something was terribly wrong. No matter how long they ran, the hallway never seemed to end. The doors lining both sides of the corridor appeared and disappeared without warning, as if the house itself were constantly reshaping its own layout. Behind them, the sound of footsteps continued.